Panelists, I would love to begin with a round of intros on today's call, which is trans youth power and hormone therapy. And I'd love to invite you all to go in the order that you all are listed on the screen, going from left to right. For accessibility purposes, the first time that you speak, please go ahead and give a visual descriptor of yourself. And a reminder that every time you speak to introduce yourself with your name, just to make sure that everyone is aware of who's speaking. And I'm actually going to go first to sort of break my own rule of going in the order on the screen because I'm not on the screen. My name is Arielle. I use they, them pronouns. I'm based in Chicago, and I am a slightly blonde, depending on the angle, slightly brunette, white trans person wearing a keffiyeh, and I have a green background with a sort of rainbow-ish squiggly on the side, and I will popcorn over to Ericka, who's the next on my screen.
Thanks, Arielle. My name's Ericka. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I am a Black, non-binary femme with short shoulder length-ish, chin length-ish, curly hair or twisted hair, Black twisted hair with a orange and pink kind of swirly background. I am a senior national organizer with the Disability Project at the Transgender Law Center, and I am based on Lenape land in Brooklyn, New York. And I will pass it to Zane.
Hey y'all, my name is Zane McNeill. I use he, him, and they, them pronouns. I am a white, queer, and trans person with long brown hair, wearing a color-blocked pink and black corduroy shirt. From West Virginia, currently in Tokyo, and super excited to be here. And I'll popcorn to Gabriel.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gabriele-Marion, and my pronouns are they, he. You're also welcome to address me with just my name and no pronouns. Today, I'm calling from a red sofa in front of a beige wall with a painting nailed on it. My skin is light brown, my hair is short and dark, and I appear androgynously as a two-spirit person. I am calling from Kuso-Nachis land, the land of my ancestors. I am also Black Native American. I'm wearing glasses today as well as a denim blue farm shirt. For 4 years, I've spent my time serving as an artistic advocate for transgender and other marginalized rights. This fall, I also had the privilege of testifying against the anti-trans proposals of U.S. versus Skirmetti as an intersex two-spirited citizen of South Carolina. And I'll pass it to Sara.
Hey everyone, good to be here. My name is Sara Mar. I use they, them pronouns. I am the advocacy and communication strategist at Whitman Walker Institute based in DC. I am a light-skinned Southeast East Asian person with short black hair and a golden button-up, also with an orange and pink swirly background. And I will pass it over to Shawn.
Hey y'all, I'm Shawn Meerkamper. I use they pronouns. I'm the managing attorney at Transgender Law Center. I'm a white, non-binary, 30-something person wearing glasses and have red hair, which is cut and styled in a way that neutral observers have described as very punk rock. I'm also wearing a navy blue and tan plaid shirt, and I have the same orange swirly background that other folks have mentioned.
I did go ahead and try to give everyone the identical background, but for some reason, Zoom decided that Gabriel was not allowed to have one. And so for those observing the mystery that is Zoom, that is in fact what happened. So Shawn, I'd actually love for you to get us kicked off. I'd love to hear a quick primer on this case that a few of us have mentioned tonight, U.S. versus Skrmetti, which you spearheaded on behalf of TLC and amicus brief efforts for. And I'm curious to hear from you, what felt most important in the approach you took? And also, what impact do you hope that this approach that you all took will have both on the case and also on the issue of trans youth power more broadly?
Sure. Thanks, Arielle. So, US v. Skirmetti, the case, is going before the Supreme Court coming up. If you're on this call, you, I guess, are likely aware that over the last couple of years, depending on how you count, 23 or 24 states have banned medical transition, hormone therapy, and puberty blockers for trans folks who are under the age of 18. Almost every single one of those laws has faced a challenge in the courts from nonprofits like Transgender Law Center or like our friends at places like the ACLU or Lambda Legal. And some have been blocked by the courts. Some are unfortunately in effect right now. US v. Skrmetti is the one of those cases, the version of that case, if you will, that has made it to the Supreme Court first. It is the challenge to the Tennessee ban. And two things specifically about the case that I want to make sure everyone's sort of aware of before I talk about our amicus brief. One thing is that as this case is appearing before our Supreme Court, the question here is, do these bans violate the Constitution and specifically the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment? And I say that because when lawsuits challenged these bans, we had a whole sort of array of legal theories that different organizations used in challenging them. And so this is the one specific question that the court is deciding. So the court's decision is not, are these bans okay or are they not okay? The question is, are they illegal in this specific way? That's one thing. The other thing I want to make sure people know is that even though the case at this point is called US v. Skrmetti, this is not just a fight between the United States and the Attorney General of the state of Tennessee, right? This case was brought by trans youth in Tennessee who were affected by this ban, was brought by their parents who support them, and it was brought by doctors who treat them. So there all are real humans involved, right? This is not just a question of the federal government disagreeing with a state government. Now, for our amicus brief. So if folks aren't familiar, an amicus brief is when people who have an interest in the outcome of a case, but who aren't direct parties in the case, file a brief with the court and say, hey, this is what we think. Think about this case from this angle, right? In this case, at the Supreme Court level, there were 31 amicus briefs that were supporting overturning this ban. And they come from all sorts of perspectives. They are from doctors who treat gender dysphoria in youth. They're from loving parents of trans youth. They're from philosophers who have ideas about it. And when Transgender Law Center's legal team was looking at this sort of wide array of different perspectives that were going to be put in front of the Supreme Court, it dawned on us that, wait a minute, there's not actually any amicus brief yet that is here that is just about trans youth speaking in their own words, speaking truth to power, saying this is what these bans mean to us. This is how you are messing up our lives. So that was really sort of the guiding principle behind our brief. Transgender Law Center very much, I think, believes in a nothing about us without us approach. And so the impact that I hope the brief has is that I hope folks read these trans youth words and really understand that at the end of the day, that's what this is about.
Thank you so much, Shawn. I really appreciate that. And I think something to just name is that nothing about us without us is a rallying cry that often is attributed to disability justice movements, but is also used to message across additional movements with an understanding that all of us should be included in conversations that impact us. And sort of, to that effect of recognizing the humans behind these bans, recognizing youth power and encouraging, welcoming in trans young people who have been impacted by these bans to speak in their own words. We have Gabrielle with us here today, who was one of the people who was actually part of this amicus brief. So Gabrielle, I'd love to hear from you. What is it that you wish more people, and specifically the journalists in this room, understood about trans young people who need to access hormone therapy and other forms of gender affirming care?
Hi again, I'm Gabrielle. Thank you so much for your question, Arielle. While giving my thoughts, I'd like to use my own experiences with HRT and gender-orientated surgery as sort of an anecdote. My story is sadly not a completely joyous one, but I hope that it not only shows the importance of HRT access, but healthcare that is not dictated by cisgender standards as a whole. The US versus Skirmetti brief was one of a few times I publicly shared my story as a two-spirit youth living with an intersex condition, meaning that my sex characteristics do not necessarily align with a typical male-female binary. As shared before, growing up in a rigid rural town did not afford me or children like me inclusive resources to better help them understand HRT, intersex conditions, and transgender journeys. When my condition triggered a massive stress and early onset puberty, I could have easily gone to a doctor and used puberty blockers to ease my stresses and hormone imbalances starting as early as age 9. Nothing had to be permanent then, and with the right guidance, I could have also found another solution if the one I had selected did not suit me in the long run. Joining a support group for teens navigating unique gender experiences would have also worked fine, but I did not know of any at the time. That's what autonomy is really all about to me. And I want folks to understand that HRT is not the only form of trans affirming care available, although it can be a life-changing treatment for many. It's also absolutely not the only health care at stake in cases like US versus Skirmetti. Unfortunately, the doctors I saw did not share this mindset of mine. That day, they also pressured me into undergoing an invasive surgery, which would, in their words, normalize my body and remove my pain. This, of course, was a disorientating experience at age 14, and it only worsened my hormonal irregularity a year later. And to manage the chronic discomfort I face now because of that operation, I'll likely need to take hormone replacement therapy for the rest of my life, even if I am not medically transitioning as a gender non-conforming person. My point here is that HRT and the stressful conditions it can heal are not new or strange in America or anywhere else in the world. I've lived as an intersex person since 2006, a perfect year to be born. And I say that we trans endocrinology patients deserve empathy and earnesty at all times. Nobody ever asked to live as a minority or in misery because of a marginalized identity, whether they gain that identity from birth or find it within themselves later on. Today, there are so many compassionate physicians who understand gender dysphoria and other transgender experiences, plus the few risks and many rewards of HRT, but their names are not RF Kennedy Jr., Texas Governor Greg Abbott, or even Texas State Attorney General Jonathan Skirmetti. Those men cannot ever comprehend the pride or perseverance of trans youth like me in this battle for HRT because they themselves have often or really ever had to fight for such essential rights for themselves. If we do not protect our legal right to choose treatment methods and receive safe surgeries from open-minded professionals, medical abuse stories like mine will be written in history again and again. Even if HRT may not suit every transition, which is completely understandable, HRT, like any medication, can rouse undesirable side effects. I do want more people to understand that a freedom to choose HRT is a medical and social liberty worth fighting for. It rings to a right to autonomy, self-expression, LGBT affirming therapies and programs, and most of all, pain relief in your own body without being misunderstood or belittled.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle. I really appreciate that. I think, hearing what underscored a lot of what you shared is this right to autonomy, which is not something that we often hear talked about for young people. Young people in our society are often talked about as being at the whims of their parents, which under the legal systems we live in, they often are, right? Like there are gatekeepers for all of us in society, including medical professionals and government officials. But for young people, often the first gatekeepers are parents. We don't often hear the idea that young people deserve autonomy over their bodies, but we know that young people do because all people do. And that is a value that unites all of us in this space. And sort of pivoting from that, Sara, I'd love to hear from you because a big part of your work specifically is working with medical providers who want to speak with the media and encouraging them to tell stories that not only like elevate their perspectives as professionals, but also still highlight the importance of centering and uplifting trans youth and bodily autonomy. And so I'd love to hear from you how you do this, how you bring forth medical provider stories while also balancing the need to center trans youth autonomy and trans youth power.
Yeah, thanks for that question. This is Sara. Yeah, so medical providers are a really critical part of the support team that I see around trans youth to really work alongside them as they navigate their gender identity and the care that they need. And the providers I work with are really just so dedicated to their practice, and I believe can be really great messengers to talk about the trans youth that they've seen over their careers and how those young people thrive when they can get the support and the access to healthcare that they need. I think it's also really important to remember that providers are often like family medicine physicians, pediatricians, adolescent medicine physicians, depending on the age of the young person, which means that they see youth who aren't trans. And so they can really speak to how this particular segment of care, gender affirming care, is being targeted as a result of the media climate, of the disinformation, and really speak to the impacts both on their patients and their clinic and their communities. In terms of, we're talking a little bit about avoiding those right-wing traps and rhetoric. It's really easy right now to talk about how bad things are. And I think that weighs on a lot of us very personally. We see coverage about trans youth leaving their communities for care, providers talking about some of the impacts on their patients and clinics, whether that's like bomb threats at Boston Children's and other hospitals and such. And that fear and anxiety is super real. Like, I don't want to discredit that, but also I think we can do a lot to share those narratives. Again, uplifting trans joy and like possibility. Again, like those providers that I work with have very long careers, and they might have seen a young person who in their teens, and now that young person is a young adult, and maybe they are an entrepreneur, or they're going to community college, four-year college, working in the arts, like whatever it is, there are just so many endless possibilities for who trans youth can be and become when they have the support and the care that they need. And then I think lastly, like we've touched a little bit on this, but that frame of protecting kids, protecting youth, I think in that frame, we really can shift it to talking about rights, like the right for young people to get the care that they need, the right to bodily autonomy, as Gabrielle mentioned, the right to determine our own future and what that looks like for us. And so not losing sight of that, again, to your point, Arielle, that, we think about often adults in this context, but we all have certain rights, and we all should have that right to live as our healthiest selves.
Yeah, and I think messaging about trans youth autonomy or youth autonomy in general really paints the vision of the future that we all want to live in, right? Like a world where every single person, whether or not they're trans, like no matter who they are, no matter where they live, have the right to make decisions for their own bodies. We hear this in the fight for reproductive justice as well, and in disability justice movements as well. It's a right to autonomy over our bodies. And so, Zane, I want to hear from you as the journalist sitting on this panel. You've been reporting on gender affirming care and hormone therapy bans for a number of years now at Truth Out. Now you're independent. I would love to hear what is most important to you about your approach to this coverage, and also if and how your approach to this has shifted in the years since you've been doing this, especially because there's been a lot happening in the news in the world since you started covering this beat. I'd love to hear this from you.
Thanks so much. This is Zane. Yeah, I feel like one of my first stories at Truth Out was on one of the gender affirming care bans in Georgia, right? It just passed the Senate, and it was going to be called like a disaster, a legislative disgrace, I think was the exact words. And at that time, there were a good number, like a legislative onslaught, right, of gender for trans kids. And so when I started working on it, I really wanted to couch it in couch these incidents in this larger orchestrated attack, right? And really focus on statistics. So I included like numbers from the ACLU that tracked how many attacks on LGBT rights. So we're a movement advancement project and the Trevor Project, which really focused on how detrimental these bans were for trans youth's mental health. Because I really wanted to focus on the scale and coordination of these attacks. And I really would recommend that journalists do that, right? Not just focus on this one incident, but how it's a larger wave happening in many states, and really focus on how it's affecting trans youth. But at the same time, right, there's so much bad news all the time, and it's in a lot of ways it's getting worse. And so, like people have said on this panel, it's so important to focus on joy and humanity and resilience, especially when there is an attempt to dehumanize trans people right now, and really center those who are directly impacted, right? I think like that's one of the themes we've been talking about is really trans youth know what they want. They know what they need. They just need to be given a platform to talk about it. And so amplifying the voices of these trans advocates and organizers is really important. And so I've kind of shifted to, yes, cover these bans and legislative attacks and issues in the courts, but really also just movements. So I've reported on walkouts, mutual aid initiatives like the Transcontinental Pipeline and Transitional Justice, which provides critical support to those who are fleeing these bans. And then I really have been trying to balance the harm, like the mental health impacts and barriers to care, with stories of solidarity within trans community, because trans people are not just victims by these attacks. Trans youth are not victims, right? These kids are leading the fight for their own survival. So people are currently preparing for worst case scenarios under the next Trump administration. But at the same time, right, we're creating mutual aid networks, especially in regards to being able to access HRT and keep ourselves safe. So this is one case. It's going to have a detrimental effect, right? Possibly a very large consequence on trans kids. But at the same time, there's a history of attacks on our rights, and people and trans folks specifically have always organized their own care. So I would recommend reporters really focus on not just the urgency of this moment, but also the strength of those who are affected.
Yeah, thank you so much. It really makes me think of sort of this initiative that is launched at Trans Law Center of the, it's called Care is Our Legacy. And just this idea that the way that trans people, our communities and other marginalized communities, communities of color, disabled communities, immigrant communities have always survived is by being in relationships of care within their own communities, and really like seeing how that relates to this moment in time, where, you know, folks are showing up for each other, not just within trans communities, but across marginalized communities, and how that is the way we have historically fought back against oppression, against state violence, and is what we're doing again in this moment. So thank you so much for all of that, Zane. And I want to talk sort of about the state attacks, about the far right strategy, but for a minute here, I'm curious, you know, we've seen that far right bad actors have already exported the strategies of the ways that they're targeting hormone therapy to also attack access to reproductive health care. And Parker, if you can click to the next slide here, that would be great. Thank you. I'd love to hear now from Ericka and from then from Gabrielle afterwards. You both sort of work across movement spaces. Ericka, your work crosses across disability justice and gender justice and racial justice spaces. Gabrielle, yours across intersex work and trans work and various other spaces as well. And so I'm curious to hear from you how this demand we're hearing from all of our panelists for trans youth justice and trans youth power connects to other forms of justice on the ground.
Thanks, Arielle. So as a disabled non-binary person, I really work at the intersections between disability justice and trans justice, and recognizing that the fight for trans youth, like gender-affirming care, and the fight for access to hormone replacement therapy and other forms of gender-affirming care connects to decades of activism and blood and sweat and tears of disabled folks, regardless of gender identity, around bodily autonomy and what that means and all that can accomplish, or all that can encompass and accomplish, in what does it mean to have bodily autonomy. And we can't talk about bodily autonomy without talking about ableism and the idea that someone's worth and inherent right to dignity and even inherent right to be alive, to have a life, depends on how a body produces for capitalism, how healthy a body is perceived to be based on what we know to be ideals steeped in white supremacy. We know that ableism also encompasses how controllable a body can be or seems to be. And what we see throughout justice movements is that what we're really talking about is dismantling ableism, dismantling eugenics, thinking about how do we have the right, how do we organize for the right to live our lives with dignity and care and the things that we need. And that's across justice movements. We see that with reproductive health care, with migrant and immigrant rights, with climate justice. And so I really think that disability justice organizing is something that is inherently something that's anti-ableist and anti-eugenic, and is something that can be carried throughout justice movements as a throughstone for what we're fighting for.
Yeah, Gabrielle, you want to hop in there?
Of course. Thank you, Arielle and Ericka. This is Gabrielle again. Through the social distress of the last 8 years, I am at least glad to see an increased understanding of how a bill's effect on one demographic can inflict harsh restrictions on several others without us even realizing when it first begins. Maintaining the choice to pursue HRT does so much more than granting peace of mind to the trans community, though bans will never banish the resilience within us all. Unwittingly, this fight for HRT access also aligns with movements working to uplift the voiceless of countless Americans who too have been daunted by malpractice and discrimination fabricated as sacrifices for what they call the greater good of this country. My examples are far from a complete list when I name events like the overturning of Roe versus Wade, homophobic desires to destroy marriage equality and LGBT pride celebrations, the ableism and classism in denying elderly, immigrated, low-income, and disabled people assistance programs, safe havens, or the right to even rest in public spaces. I also think of the politicization of essential treatments like Narcan to reverse drug overdoses, abortions, as mentioned in Roe versus Wade, oral contraceptives, and insulin, as well as the fundamentals of white nationalism, which has been amped, so to say, by the Trump administration from our president-elect. Remaining loyal to groups, in my opinion, is so important. We should always be proud to feel a part of the groups we identify with, especially marginalized ones. However, in this battle for HRT access, we must be mindful and remember that our choices today do not just maintain our personal freedoms, but set a precedent for others facing political prejudice. Red states next door to Tennessee, where U.S. versus Skirmetti is again the state official of Tennessee. Like mine, often take inspiration from other states' discriminatory decisions in a swift, sinister manner. If Skirmetti is successful in what he aims to do, I can easily foresee the many more barriers that trans folks, though rare in small agricultural communities like mine, will face when seeking HRT, inclusive resources, and support groups to aid their transitions, or even just to hear more perspectives outside of the cis heteronormative worldview. When researching non-white communities like mine, I also found that Black and Brown Americans significantly face more barriers when accessing the aforementioned treatments. A 2023 report by Jillian McCoy at Boston University School of Public Health, for example, analyzes these struggles thoroughly, and I'd be happy to link the report in this meeting. Though I, as a trans person of color, am fortunate to be connected with grassroots organizations like We Are Family in Charleston, South Carolina, I am still daunted by the same challenges that described in their medical report, especially considering that I also live in a small, same-minded town 17 miles away from the support group's location. It is a very long drive, and I'm happy that online resources are available to youth like myself. By maintaining access to HRT, we show that we value the triumphs and tribulations of gender diverse Americans and refuse to have our voices suppressed. Additionally, our discussions in favor of HRT also keep trans affirming nonprofits and educational resources thriving in all of our communities, so that one day no person of any marginalized status may feel ostracized or uninformed about their unique experiences. And this again plays so well into our fight for autonomy.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to kick it back to Shawn to sort of bring this back over to the legal angle and what we might see in this Skrmetti case. And actually, sorry, I updated the deck. If you could reload this slide should have switched. But Shawn, bringing us back to this moment in time specifically, I'm curious how the outcome of the Skrmetti case might impact healthcare, not just for trans people, but for all people.
Yeah. So earlier I said, right, that this case is about this specific question of are these bans legal or not under this specific constitutional provision. I'm going to take that back now and say that actually the real question, right, when you get past that, the real question in this case is, can powerful interest groups like the Heritage Foundation or Alliance Defending Freedom, right? Can powerful interests make up lies about your healthcare and then use those lies to make your healthcare illegal, right? Because that's what's happening here. This is a manufactured controversy, right? People say over and over again, it's become like a chorus that like every major medical association knows and understands and advocates that this care is safe and effective and necessary and life-saving, right? So much so that like the other side has to have a fake advocacy organization, right? The American College of Pediatricians, which was sort of founded to be an anti-queer and trans hate group with a very official sounding name to go out there and oppose this healthcare, right? You know, that to me is the real question here, right? Especially at a time when Robert Kennedy Jr. is getting nominated to be in charge of the Department of Health and Human Services, right? Who has some really like, has never met a conspiracy theory, health-related conspiracy theory that he did not love. And so, right, it sounds outlandish because it is outlandish. But when you put powerful interest groups behind it, this, the fact that this case has gotten this far, that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, thank you so much for really highlighting that. And I want to also hear from Sara. We're talking a lot about some of the losses we've seen, and I know Zane, you specifically talked about a need to highlight wins as well. And so Sara, I'd love to hear from you, like, why it is important to highlight the policy wins and like organizing efforts that specifically trans folks, but also other marginalized communities are conducting on the ground, and not just the losses. And I'm also curious for you if there are specific stories that you would like to see uplifted by journalists and storytellers in the media.
Yeah, thanks. This is Sara again. Yeah, policy tends to be super slow and long and draining. And the way the system is set up, it just takes so much energy to navigate the political process for how something comes to be. And so when we win, it's because of that, as you mentioned, mass mobilizing, organizing among trans folks, among our allies, and across movements, and highlighting those wins is just so important to let the community know that positive change is possible and really keeping that energy alive. That kind of reporting can send messages to our community and to our policymakers that trans folks aren't going anywhere. We're going to keep showing up on the steps of the Capitol, in the courtrooms, again, in the streets of our community with our neighbors. Like, we're still here, and we're going to keep in this, like, that those attempts to isolate us and make us feel scared or mobilize us with this political process is not going to work. And so in terms of stories, I mean, yeah, particularly in context of Skirmetti coming up, I think we should also really highlight, there's a lot of anxiety, around what could happen at the Supreme Court, but I think we should highlight that lower courts have ruled in our favors, that governors in red states have vetoed these bans before. And it's a really good reminder that when people can hear from trans young people, and when they logically look at the evidence, judges and some of these governors can see how these bans are really unjust, have no sensical basis or evidence basis to them. One ruling I would point folks to, which was a while ago now, but Judge Hinkle, who's out of one of the district courts in Florida. I'm just going to read a quote from part of his opinion because I thought it was quite good. It's 105 pages, but I'll post the link if folks want to read it later. But Judge Hinkle wrote, quote, "The elephant in the room should be noted at the outset. Gender identity is real. For some, the denial that transgender identity is real is not different in kind or intensity from the animus that has attended racism and misogyny. The state of Florida cannot flatly deny transgender individuals safe and effective medical treatment with medications routinely provided to others with the state's full approval, so long as the purpose is not to support the patient's transgender identity," end quote. And so I thought those little pieces is great. One, gender identity is real, we're here. Two, the fact that kind of drawing those threads that this is clearly animus that fuels other attacks on, for example, DEI. He talks about racism and misogyny. And then really drawing that thread that, yeah, these medications, this treatment is available to any other trans young person if they're accessing that care for a reason other than gender dysphoria. And so, yeah, I'll post a link there, but I think highlighting that judges have ruled on our side, and I think that'll be really important as we head into the Skirmetti case.
Yeah, I think this is awesome. And I think a couple of things I want to uplift that a couple of you have mentioned is this idea that this is very clearly a targeted, manufactured attack on trans people specifically, right? There's not any reason beyond a small group of far-right bad actors that decided to make trans people a political wedge issue and manufacture national like war against trans people. I mean, that's like the clear reason why this is all happening. And it's important also to uplift how many wins there have been, right? Like we have organizers and advocates have struck down and fought back successfully against way more anti-trans bills than have passed. And so Zane, with a lot, it segues very nicely back into coverage specifically, with oral arguments for Skrmetti now coming up in about 2 weeks. I'd love to hear from you. What are you hoping is the focus of media coverage? What types of stories are you hoping to see? And maybe are there any like narratives or stories that you're kind of tired of seeing and would rather not see repeated this time around?
Thanks, y'all. This is Zane again. I'm going to reiterate a few things that people have already said, right? But I really hope coverage in this case really contextualizes this one oral argument and Supreme Court case as part of this larger effort, this orchestrated, manufactured effort to restrict autonomy and individual freedoms, including, body autonomy and privacy for all people. It's just trans people are sometimes the first folks on the cutting block. I think much like the aftermath of Dobbs, which was a case that overturned Roe v. Wade, this case does threaten to set a precedent for rolling back other rights and other liberties, and then can be cited again for future attacks. I also think that coverage should really focus on the discriminatory intent, behind these bans, and how it's aren't just isolated culture war issues, but is orchestrated and tied to other attacks on abortion restrictions, anti-DEI, and other aggressive policies pushed by the actors we've talked about before, like the Alliance Defending Freedom and the Heritage Foundation. And when we're talking about this one case or other cases that make it to the Supreme Court or even other federal courts, I think it's important to notice that the law is not apolitical, and really focus on who was appointing these judges and who's interpreting this and why. I think about like 90% of Trump's first administration's federal judicial appointments were members of the Federal Society, which is a conservative legal organization that really is sort of incestuous with these other far-right groups we've talked about. And so while this case is really important for trans folks and will have a really large impact on trans folks, I think it's also important to know that the law has long been weaponized against trans communities. No matter how this case comes out, trans people continue to exist and survive and thrive and find joy. And we've consistently built networks of care and resistance movements outside of legal structures, like we saw during the AIDS epidemic and other attacks on our community and harm. We figure out ways to live. And for things I'm hoping that won't be repeated is this sort of both sidesism. I think sometimes reporters, in an effort to seem apolitical, end up trying to uplift both sides as if they both have standing. And as we've mentioned, every major medical organization supports gender affirming care as necessary and important. And a lot of these groups that are bringing these issues create fake organizations and fake dissent to create fake controversy. And so there's not an equal standing between wanting trans kids to be able to survive and live and have access to the care they need, and this web orchestrating this coordinated effort on eroding our rights. So really sort of taking off that shroud and figuring out and really naming who is doing this and why, and how it's not just a controversy that is legal or not targeting queer folks.
Yeah, thank you so much. Your mention of the AIDS epidemic also sort of, segues nicely into what I want to hear from Ericka, which is about the idea of eugenics, which is very clear how that came up during the AIDS epidemic, right? Like a group of people that was predominantly dying was queer and trans folks of color. And as such, the government ignored it and egged it on. And so I'm curious to hear from you, Ericka, how the ideas of ableism and eugenics really underpin like all these attacks that we're seeing across the country against our bodies. And specifically, hormone therapy and what journalists should make of this.
Yeah. So just a little bit first on like what eugenics is for folks. So eugenics literally is the desire to have a pure, healthy, like white stock of people that can continue to create more pure, healthy white people. Generally cisgendered, generally cishet folks, generally class male folks. And that what that creates is this control of all of us who don't fit into that. So we think about disabled folks, we think about Black folks, people of color, Indigenous folks, poor folks, migrants and immigrants. And what eugenic logic creates is this idea that everyone else's body is inherently wrong and that we either have to control, surveil, criminalize, and literally disappear or disappear, dispose of folks who don't fit into that kind of white supremacist, anti-Black idea of eugenics. And so when we think about hormone therapy and thinking about the generalized attacks on trans bodies, really thinking about how eugenics and ableism is creating this narrative that trans bodies are things that are bodies that shouldn't be, that don't fit into what the white, cishet, wealthy male ideal is, and therefore it have to be controlled, have to be surveilled, have to be criminalized, have to be disposed of. And what we also think about that I wanted to mention in terms of eugenics and ableism and thinking about how these systems work, I think it's really important that journalists think about the systems, not just the interpersonal, either interpersonal attacks, interpersonal violence, interpersonal stories of people. We have to think about the systems that are creating the context for how all this is happening. And at the Disability Project with my colleague Sebastian, what we talk a lot about is the disability carceral state and this idea that there are systems in place that surveil, criminalize, and dispose of disabled people specifically outside of prisons and jails. And we're thinking about kids who are in group homes, for example, kids who are in institutions, kids who are in special education, adults that are under guardianship. Those kids like can't even have these conversations about hormone therapy, can't have these conversations about gender or gender identity because things are so controlled and everything is so surveilled and so criminalized. So when we think about what I want like folks to really take away from and understand is that we have to make sure that we aren't, like Gabrielle was saying earlier, that we're in solidarity with like actual in solidarity with other movements, and really thinking about how this moment, how do we get smarter and how do we get more strategic to use gains for trans youth to also create space and create gains for youth across the board. And so I think that's something that I really want folks to take away from this. And then also as a little like preview teaser, we have a journalist guide specifically on disability and how to report on disability issues and disability justice that's coming out soon. So if folks are interested, definitely look out for that because there's a lot more on this.
Yes, Ericka, and I'm meeting in 2 weeks to finalize that guide. So it's coming to you all soon. We're very excited to finally share it with the world. We have been working on it for several months. I've partnered with the Disability Project folks who have led this work, and it's something that we're almost ready to share with the world. And so, bringing it back to you one last time, Gabrielle, I'd love to hear, you have now lived through, like really through your adolescence, this escalation in anti-trans attacks. And in the interest of encouraging journalists to continue to adopt a humanizing lens that centers people that are most impacted, such as yourself, I'd love to, I'd love for you to share with the journalists in this room, like what that has been like for you living through these past few years of anti-trans and anti-justice attacks.
All right, Gabrielle speaking again. In truth, Arielle, it's been extremely tough as most imagine. Many members of my chosen family, somewhat fortunately, live in states that are traditionally more left-leaning, such as California and Oregon. I am very vocal about my distaste for this when and especially considering this year's election results, as well as many conflicts that we are now facing, especially with more vehement bills against transgender youth, as many of my loved ones do. But my heart aches most when my family and neighbors seem as though they would readily make a scapegoat out of trans and other marginalized justice movements. Some do know that I am transgender, some do not. But either way, it still is such a painful experience for me either way. I do digress a bit. No matter what parts of progressive justice we're fighting for the majority of us activists here in the South, particularly South Carolina, we're still trying to grapple with the mere existence of these bans and the unsettling results, again, of this year's election. All we can really do is keep hope and take it all in stride. Mental health must come first in these daunting times. And I often encourage folks to rest from the revolutionary path if needed. Many people often hear me say practicing self-care and finding authentic peace is a form of protest in this time. But on the battleground, one of the most daunting questions I've asked myself is what bills could Skirmetti inspire in South Carolina and neighboring states? The answer is not pretty, but organizations like South Carolina United do an amazing job at breaking down each of these bigoted bills, such as the Parents' Rights Bill, aiming to ban sexual education and lessons about LGBT rights, history, and acceptance in public charter schools. Another example off the top of my head that comes immediately is Spotlight Bill H.4624, which, like Skirmetti, aims to prevent youth from accessing puberty blockers and HRT. South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster slyly supports this bill, to my greatest chagrin. But it's heartening to remember too, we do have victories in this valiant battle, as you all have said. Even the ability to connect with journalists tonight, as well as other activists through this panel, is a small win for us all. And there are many joys in my life that are much like it. For instance, when I go on my college campus this month, I feel comfort and love for who I am, even if widely sharing my name or pronouns is not a daily priority. Nearly all of my classmates as minorities in STEM are all united in this grief and understanding because we see each other as real people despite the chaos in our state and national capital. I'm also now seeing a lot more queer people very adamant about defending their freedoms alongside people who live with disabilities. And they also come to the stage when it comes to advocating for trans youth and trans affirming care, because they too understand the struggle of what it means to have, say, marriage licenses, necessary medicine at stake when it comes to these selfish bills. I am now very happy to see intersectionality awareness grow more and more, as we not only brave these transphobic bills, but also fight for families who have lost everything, whether it be to the war, namely the war and genocide in Palestine, poverty across America and other countries, natural disasters, particularly the one in North Carolina that we just saw with our previous hurricane. And especially if there are storms worsened by climate change, which I see a lot of trans and queer people more and more passionate about each year. As an agriculturist and artist, I'm very happy to see all these things. And I see people connecting with not only systems that are helping them flourish, that are not corrupt and punishing to who they are, but with a charm of nature wherever they can find it in their neighborhoods or even beyond when they go and travel and explore the world. They may also create art just to release some hurt that they feel inside or help a progressive cause. Some people even use their art as charitable foundations to raise money for causes that mean a lot to them, including myself. And on top of it, and on the topic of safe spaces, LGBT affirming areas and centers are serving and standing strong each day and night so they can bring a little soundness to our lives. And this is something I always appreciated. My soul, I feel like it is slowly healing every day, even when some challenges and advocacy seem grueling or even on my worst days, worthless to fight. I see that America is not completely devoid of empathy, even when the news or even our social medias tell us that the world has essentially gone to crap. And I'm really looking forward to see what our movement can do, even with these trials that we face on a legislative and government level. We can definitely power through it all, even when it's our darkest times.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle. That was beautiful. Yeah, really just, grounding everyone in personal experience. Zane, I something that I tend to ask in each of these webinars, because this is a real problem that comes up in newsrooms, is, a lot of journalists, unfortunately, work in newsrooms where even if they have really wonderful practices and understand everything that we've said here today about, the stories that we on this panel and we as advocates want to see, that's not always reflected in newsroom leadership and editors. And so what advice can you give to journalists whose editors or newsroom leadership might be hesitant to adopt these practices?
Thanks so much. This is Zane again. I have a bit of advice. I know it can be really difficult for us. I've been really lucky to work in newsrooms and spaces that really wants to center trans folks and our stories. But for so many journalists, it can be really difficult to navigate. If you're able and feel safe enough to try to campaign for better coverage, which I know a ton of journalists have done, really it sort of quietly and under the scenes, and sometimes more loudly. I think there's a few things that we can do to try to persuade newsrooms and the people who are paying the newsrooms to really want to tell these stories and tell them well. I think first off, it's bad reporting to not do so and to not tell these stories and to not really center trans youth, and the idea that every major medical association says and has done research saying that hormone therapy is safe and needed. I think also it can be really important to say, hey, our stories are harming people. Our bad coverage is having a negative political impact. We've seen that specifically, unfortunately, with like the New York Times bias, endangering trans people by publishing inaccurate and disinformation pretty much on trans healthcare, because these groups like the ADF don't have research on their side. They are really grasped at straws, and have even cited op-eds published in the New York Times because their position is so unfounded. I also think that if you don't feel safe enough to really advocate really openly with managers or something like that, then you can also just build relationships with trans activists and organizations, get press releases in, have relationship with sources, and just bring those voices in as part of your normal reporting, and really pitch these stories as necessary and important, and keep going back to those research I was talking about that Movement Advancement Project, Trevor Project has done, and try to advocate in that way. And then lastly, there's just a lot of resources available. I know we've talked a little bit about TLC's reporting guides, but there's also resources at the Transgender Journalist Association. They have a style book and coverage guide that can really help reporters and editors improve their coverage.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so connect with TLC for a story. Thank you so much for putting them in the chat. I also just popped Trans Journalists Association's link in the chat because, as Zane mentioned, they have a number of resources for reporting on trans communities. Before we get to the Q&A, and I do encourage anyone who'd like to ask to pop questions in the Q&A chat, I've also just enabled folks in the audience to message hosts and panelists. So if you feel uncomfortable with that, feel free to do it. I would love to hear from two of y'all. Specifically, like when you envision a hopeful future for trans people in the US, and I believe that there is hope in our future because we have to when we're fighting for that. What does that look like? Like what does it look like to fight? What does the future itself look like? And also, how can journalists and storytellers help us get there? And in the interest of time, I will ask folks to keep it to like pretty concise.
I'll hop in. This is Sarah. So when I envision the future, that looks like no matter what area of public life we're in, whether that's a school, park, library, our own homes, knowing that no matter where we go, that we'll be not just safe, but also embraced for who we are and that our humanity is recognized. And for journalism, I think journalism is such a powerful way to shape that narrative ecosystem that we all live in and really share with the world. Again, I think of possibilities again, like share with the world who we are and who we have the ability to become when we have access to both healthcare we need and other like critical supports in our life.
Thank you so much.
I can also hop in. This is Zane. I feel like when I think of dreaming futures that we can exist in, it's futures where we're able to choose how we want to live and feel safe all the time. Not having to be productive just for the sake of productivity under capitalism, right? Having our just respect in who we are and what we want to do, feeling safe in our different positions in the world, and being able to choose every day without this the stress or the potential of harm, right? And just to exist freely. And I think for me personally, why my background's more in activist scholarship, and then I moved from this sort of academic writing into journalism was because I felt like I could better write these stories and make a quicker impact on trying to translate those dreams of the future into everyday coverage. And so I think journalism is so important because I get to talk about these issues that are really exhausting and hard for me to talk about, but then also bring in other folks I want to hear from that keep helping me feel grounded and on the path towards that future. And so I feel like writing is so important because it is a way of translating the world we want to see into the world and roadmap to how we get there.
Thank you so much. This is Arielle, and I will actually share some as well. Something that I think about sort of in my role as a communications professional, but that also translates to, I think, really any field, is that in order to build the future that we want to live in, we have to individually believe that that world is possible. Because if we don't believe that that world is possible, like personally in our souls, and keep that sort of like hope alive as much as we can, then in ways subtle and not so subtle, we're not going to be orienting ourselves towards that dream, right? If we're constantly on the defensive and thinking about how bad things are, which like I will absolutely see, things are rough right now. We can look out into the world in the election, in the legislative landscape, in the legal landscape, and acknowledge that things are rough. And we have gotten through as communities really rough moments in our history and built the future that we live in now. And we can acknowledge that this moment is scary and difficult and tough, And building that future together involves all of us, journalists, advocates, lawyers, policy professionals, like anyone in any space they occupy, to believe that that future exists for us and then figure out how we're going to make it a reality. Thank you, panelists, for joining me today. I do see that we don't have Q&A in the box, which is totally fine. I think we covered a lot of ground today. I do want to give a few minutes now to see if anyone in the audience does have a question that they haven't had a chance to add. And while folks are adding those questions, I will invite all of the panelists here. If there is anything that you wanted to say on this panel that you didn't get an opportunity to share, I invite you, while folks are adding potentially to the Q&A box, to share that now. And it's okay if you don't.
This is Ericka. I could add something I was thinking about in terms of like visioning for the future, like thinking about how disabled people and disabled trans people have been raising like our material needs and getting our material needs met for so long, and are still like living our lives and experiencing high levels of violence and experiencing such high levels of control and things like that, and not being seen as an issue of justice. And so I would love for journalists to again, like look for those pieces of solidarity and those ways of solidarity between movements, and report, again, like reporting on not just kind of like the white classed trans person, but also like thinking about Black trans disabled people, Indigenous disabled people, poor disabled people, poor trans disabled people, and look for those stories as well.